Okay, so let's get back to our last talk of today, the bias in our data sets. And I would love to introduce our speaker, Rahaf Albakhi. Rahaf is a member of the IEEE P7003 Algorithmic Bias Considerations Working Group, where she leads the evaluation section. She is also a member of the Ethical Intelligence Experts Group. Her main focus is on the bias of AI systems and its effect on the society we live in. She works on this through giving workshops in bias, consulting on AI ethics, and conducting independent research. Rahaf holds a Master of Applied Science degree in electrical engineering from the University of Victoria, with her thesis focused on designing an acoustic modeling technique that is unbiased against people with speech disorders. With that, I will give the stage to Rahaf.
Thank you, Ha. That's very nice. I'm very excited to be here today. So I'm gonna try to share my screen. Okay. Okay, does it look good on your end?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, perfect. So today I'm going to talk about the bias in our data sets, specifically the data sets that we're using to build the AI systems that are the bias system that we want to eliminate. The outline of today's talk is really, first, we're trying to identify bias, or like to have a definition for bias, and then it's followed by 3 areas of action that you could really use as a start point for you to join the conversation, and then hopefully have you on board with amazing people solving bias in AI systems. So let's start with a big question, and what is bias? And bias actually is like, from a general point of view, is when we have an algorithm that is designed to detect or diagnose skin-related diseases that works for people with white skin but doesn't work for people with darker skin, is considered a biased algorithm. Another algorithm is a hiring algorithm that is continuously saying that male applicants are more competent than female applicants, and it keeps suggesting it to the hiring committee, and ending up with having a company that hires more men than women in the field. So that is another kind of bias. And that is really from a very general point of view. So people started noticing that there are certain social issues, or like certain social biases, that we have in day-to-day life, and that is being perfectly reflected in our technology that we have. And so we needed to find a solution for that, because when this problem is left unsolved, we're going to risk having like very big harm to our societies. These systems can be implemented in public sector services, which means it's affecting who gets and who doesn't get the basic human needs. And that is a big issue that we cannot just neglect and put aside. And so we do need a solution for that. So that's from a very general point of view about what is bias. Now let's try to narrow it down. I wouldn't say narrow it down, but let's try to have like a more specific view on the definition of bias. So bias is not a term that we can define as an isolated entity. It is something that interacts with so many other factors we need to take care of. So bias intersects with fairness. They are not the opposite. They are not the same. Bias and fairness are totally 2 different entities. However, they intersect in a very big way. And then comes discrimination. Discrimination is also a 3rd entity that is not bias and not fairness, but also something separate that we need to take into consideration. And then comes also justice. It's something that also defines what is fair, what is discrimination, what is bias. And so if we want to have a clear definition for bias, we can't have it without understanding the 3 other entities, really. And just to add another level of complexity to this definition, it's actually that these 4 entities are stuff that are also defined by the culture that we have. So the culture, depending on where this system is being deployed. So if it was deployed in Canada, Canada has like a whole different culture than this system being deployed in Japan, for example. Japan would have a different culture where we have bias fairness is defined in a different way than how do we define it here in Canada. So all of these four entities have a different definition in different countries depending on different cultures. To add to that too, other factor that we need to take into consideration is the point of view of the stakeholders. So all of these four entities and the culture would need to be seen from the point of view of the stakeholder. It's not something that we as designers of the system can decide. It's something that we need to have the stakeholders telling us about how do they see it. And so depending on the stakeholder, if we're talking about yeah, and stakeholders here, I mean the people affected by the bias of the system. So like we can group them depending on our system. Could be race, could be gender, could be religion, all different kinds of social identities that the system could discriminate against. So we need to see those and the definition of bias from the point of view of the stakeholder. And the last layer that we can add to this conversation to really have a good definition of bias is really the system purpose and all of the other system specifications that we can use to have better information on how on the meaning of bias in these three contexts. So that's a very general point of view about it, and it doesn't really help us. It just shows that the bias is really something that is not clear for us. We don't have that clear understanding of bias. We don't have that unified understanding of bias in order for us to start solving for it. We just know that there are some people who are facing difficulties when the public sector is using these algorithms, and we need to solve it, but then we don't have a clear definition of it. And that is actually the first problem that we face when we work with bias. Um, let's try to put this in a more specific way, or let's say like a start point for us to have a better definition of bias, which I like to put it in a robustness context. So in my opinion, bias is well defined if we say that a bias system is a system that is not robust enough to work well for all of the users that we have. And once we frame it in a robustness context, we can really have a start point that we can say, okay, so this is our system is not robust. Let's try to find how can we make it more robust. And on that journey, we could really start trying to define bias in a better way, define fairness in a better way, discrimination, justice, and just have that unified definition of bias. So why I'm mentioning all of that, why I'm not saying about bias in a very shortcut way, is because as you see now in the three areas of action where you can really join the conversation, you will be simultaneously working on having a better definition of bias. And the reason that we will have like different ways to do it is just because we don't have that clear definition yet. So it's very important before you start to understand that it's gonna be difficult. It's gonna be so fun, but it's gonna be difficult because we don't have that clear definition yet. So if we put it in robustness, that's a very fairly good start for us to start solve it from a technical perspective. Now going to the areas of action. So okay, we have biased system. We don't want that our hiring algorithm to be biased, and how do we solve that? There are three areas of active research right now. First is identifying bias types. The second is measuring bias, and the third is mitigating bias. So let's start with identifying bias types. Oh, okay. So we have so many different types of bias, and the reason why we need to start identifying bias types is because it's a way for us to know where is the right leverage point. If we know what is the bias that we are dealing with, it will give us better understanding of what is the root cause of bias that we have, and it will just give us a better idea for where is the right leverage point and where we could start pushing in order for us to mitigate bias in the best way possible. So here this graph shows like 20 plus different types of bias, and it's according to a survey that I can share with you. I'm not sure if the slides are going to be shared with the audience, but the reference is really interesting. I really suggest that you read it. It's a bit of over 20 pages, but it's fun to read. So it talks about different types of bias, and here it starts with really having observer bias, funding bias. Just to mention that these are 20 plus, but it's a very basic like types of bias set. It's easily like above 50 or something like that, the types of bias that we have in the data set, in the model, or in the system. So yeah, starting with funding bias. Funding bias is when we have the funding entity who are funding our research, who are funding our company, who have certain purposes they want to fulfill, and then you will feel the pressure as the observer or like the person who is performing the research to fulfill their requirements, and that will just keep propagating through your system until you have biased outcomes. So funding bias is something that starts at the very beginning. And then we have observer bias. Observer bias is me, is you, the people who are working on designing the system. When we are designing the system, we come with our personal experiences, we come with our personal beliefs, and we might be conscious about it, we might be unconscious about it, but we do have biases in ourselves too. So observer bias is something that will also keep propagating through our systems until we have biased outcomes. These two types of bias are stuff that happens before we even start building the system, and that's why it's very important to mitigate the bias at these steps by understanding the biases that we have in the team working. So observer bias also means that if you're working in a not that very diverse team, that will also mean that you will have a lot of bias in the outcomes of your system. And so working on these at a very early stage will drastically improve your algorithm towards being less biased. Then comes the data bias. Different types of data bias are really like people started noticing that. I mean, because artificial intelligence, neural network-based artificial intelligence is really based on data, and it stems its power from data and what we have. We started noticing that the data that we have perfectly represent historical bias. It's the bias that we already have. It's the bias that is already existing in our societies. And so when we are collecting the data, consciously or unconsciously, we can have the same bias that we have in our societies in the data. So that is one type of bias. And then we have started noticing, okay, so if it's historical bias, it means like less women are going to be in data science. So let's try to represent the data in a better way. We started noticing that there is representation bias. We don't have equal number of women as men in the data science field, for example. And then we started seeing that we need to have more diversity in the data set, and hopefully if we work on this type of bias by increasing the diversity, we could have less bias in the outcomes of the system. Then comes measurement bias. What are the features that we're really using in our system? What are the features that we care about? Are we using features that represent the protected attributes, which is like, do we have race? Do we have gender, ethnicity, backgrounds, or these stuff or not? And then you might also have some kinds of features that will give you like false relation, false causation relation in the outcomes of your system. Then we have sampling bias. If you're collecting the data, you might have you might not be sampling randomly enough. So one way to do this is, okay, we can play with the data and We might not have enough data about women in data science. So what we do is we synthesize data. And that actually leads to another type of bias, which is called Simpson's paradox. It's a trend in a subgroup is different than a trend in a whole group aggregated. So when you are trying to synthesize data, you are actually risking having the synthesized data representing the whole group and not representing the different subgroups of the person, of the women. And so that means that you might be risking introducing new bias types to your data. Population bias is data sets are different than the original. That could also be caused by synthetic data. And then, so that is like the basic, what we first, when we have the preliminary data set that we want to work with. Once we deploy the system and we have it up and running, and if we are collecting data through that system or through other systems, if we have a contract with them, so we can actually add more bias to our data through that collection system. So designing the system, or let's say designing the interface of the system, could also include a lot of bias. So first we have like behavioral bias. It's bias the user's behavior on that platform that is generating data that we are adding to our preliminary data could reflect the behavior bias of the person, and that bias is actually also like time dependent, so that will be temporal bias. And then we have social bias. Our opinion is affected by others' opinion. When we see people who are giving 5 stars to a restaurant, then we say, but we wanted to give 1 star, then we say, oh, maybe we were wrong, so we start giving 5 stars. So that is a type of bias that could be included and added to our basic data set of deciding what is a good restaurant, what is not. Content production bias, user generated content, it definitely like represents the bias of every user. And then we have like the user interface related bias relate to the design of the interface, really. For example, popularity bias means that more popular means better exposure. If a person keeps getting 5 stars, it will always be pushed up the list. And if people are getting less stars, that will be like being kept pushed down the list. And so if we have a drop down list and we are collecting data from this drop down list, we need to design it in a good way that we are really representing all of the possible types of groups that we can have. So if you are trying to select like a drop down list of what is your work title, you need also to include unemployed, because that would simply mean that if you don't include it, your data set will be biased towards employed people, and it could have all kinds of biased outcomes. So these are two types of bias sources, data bias, system bias, that are really related to each other. And now we have the model bias. Now, the model bias is something that is not that well researched. We have Our main understanding is that data sets are the biased ones and all the blame is to put on the data sets. However, we don't really notice that our lack of understanding of the data sets might also lead to lack of understanding of what is really the best way to process this data, and that leads to modeling bias. So for example, I would just like to note here that we have one bias type, which is algorithmic bias, and we don't have enough research on that. And that's why it's like this very dense bubble. Algorithmic bias could be divided into so many different subgroups. So what do you mean? Do you mean like it's something related to the optimizer we're using? Do you mean that this is something related to the neural network architecture that we're using? Like, what is exactly algorithmic bias? And this is only a neural network. If we want to use good old-fashioned AI, so it depends also like who is deciding what is the rule that we need to use, and there could be a lot of bias in there. So model bias is something that we need to keep paying attention to, and that is something that we can't do unless we have a good understanding of the data. And then we will know what is the right step to identify bias types in the models that we're building, really. And as you can see, like most of the other types of bias are closer to the data, and that means that we need to really start like looking at those that are a little bit further from the data and start making informed decisions on how do we really want to process data. So if you're interested in starting this career, if you're interested in starting solving this bias in your company, in your research, or wherever, you could really start by identifying bias types. And while you're doing that, you're actually also defining what is bias and helping into the conversation of having a better definition of bias in that context of fairness, discrimination, and justice. That's about the types of bias. And now we're moving to measuring bias. So, and that's related actually to one of the questions is how do we measure it? And that's a question that has been giving me a lot of sleepless nights because I'm actually working on this right now, and it's, I mean, I'm hitting my head against the wall, but it's fun. Don't get me wrong. So first we have ways to measure bias is really by having fairness definitions. Fairness definitions, for example, like equalized odds, equal opportunity, demographic parity. I'm not going to go into details about this. It's just because I believe that it's worth mentioning more like why we don't really need to go that way. So if first about fairness definition, first drawback about it is that you can't really satisfy more than one definition. And that's related to really that we don't have a unified definition of bias. And so if you're trying to do equalized odds on one algorithm and then try to do equal opportunity, you might have the first definition giving you that your algorithm is bias free, and the second algorithm saying you that your algorithm is the definition of bias. And so it's very wide. It's a wide field, and those fairness definitions are stuff that are not very well established. I mean, we have more than 20 or plus definitions of fairness too, and we can't satisfy more than two together. So I don't believe that is the way that we need to start going by defining fairness to solve bias. I think that we need to start building bias metrics. And this is something that we're actually doing right now at the at the IEEE group. We're trying to define bias metrics and that are specifically going to work for bias, and we're trying to make it as subjective as possible. We're trying to do something that would work regardless of the algorithm, like model agnostic and these stuff, and really just trying to quantify bias in numbers. So actually, it's a current conversation that we're having. To my understanding, we don't have good bias metrics, or let's say we don't have any so far. The focus is all on fairness definitions. Bias metrics is something I believe that we are starting. And so if you're interested in that, please do contact me. We need all hands on deck for this mission. And we could just figure out how you can join the group. And definitely, you don't have to be expert in the field. You don't have to be an ethicist or anything like that. We need your voice in order for us to design the best bias metric. So please join the conversation. I'll leave my email at the end, so you can email me to do that. So I can't talk a lot about bias metrics, just because we still don't know a lot about it. There are different ways to quantify it, but they're not enough. And that's why I don't have a lot to talk about this field. If you want to start taking action to mitigate bias in this field, then I would love to have a further conversation with you. Now, the third area where you can really take an action is mitigating bias. And we're usually like, and I'm not excluding myself from this, but we usually start here. We start by, okay, so how do we solve it? We're like a solution-oriented society. And I started here too. Like my master thesis was like, okay, how do we mitigate bias? And then now I started, no, we first need to measure it. And then we first need to identify the bias types. So it's mitigating bias is very important because obviously it's the solution, but it's dependent on the previous two, and it's dependent on having a definition for bias, really. So let's start by seeing like how can we really mitigate bias. So there are different techniques to mitigate bias, and there are it's related to three categories: pre-processing techniques, in-processing techniques, which we're not going to cover, and post-processing techniques that you are going to do tweak the results of the algorithm by setting a threshold and just like playing with the outcomes of the algorithm. So it's yeah, going back to pre-processing, we have different types of um, this. Okay, I'm trying to. Okay, we have different types of pre-processing techniques. First, we have variable blinding, and I'm starting from right because I believe like my personal preference is going from right. I'm not sure if it's right on your screen, but from variable blinding going all the way up to adversarial learning. They're like getting better and better techniques. First, variable blinding is a technique that now almost everybody agrees that it's not the right way to go. It means that, okay, so you have this data set and you have all of these features. What you're going to do is if you have race, um, there is something that we call protected attributes, and these are the attributes that we are legally required to not collect, or if we have it, to treat it with a very high level of respect. For example, race, religion, sex, gender, and all this stuff. So variable blinding is says, okay, simple. It's as simple as that. Just remove race from the data set, and then we're going to work on that. Now, the reason this technique doesn't really work is because variable blinding is a method that, for example, like I'm going to apply to a company and I don't want them to see that I am a female. So simply I'm going to remove my picture from LinkedIn, and whenever I'm applying, they don't know if I'm a female or a male. My name is not Canadian, so I can easily just hide behind them guessing that it's a male name just because I'm in a male dominant field. However, that doesn't really remove that I might have went to an only female school, and that is being said in my resume, where did I study, and then they will understand that I am a female, and then the algorithm is going to immediately see that word and then associate it with me as a female. So the I'm talking here about a full experience. If I'm just removing that I am a Muslim, that doesn't mean that my full experience as a Muslim person walking in the streets is going to change really, because it's the reward of the society for my personal traits, whether I'm a female, whether it's my religion, whether it's my race. And then if you're removing it, it's really not removing your experience. And so variable blinding is now known to be a technique that doesn't work. So don't try it really. You can play with it. I mean, of course, you can play with all of these techniques, and it's the only way for you to know what is the right technique for your solution. But yeah, this one is like most research papers are using it as a way to leverage their research and say that their research is better. So yeah, don't worry about it. We have transformation, and actually all of these techniques with in processing and post processing are here in this resource, which I'll also maybe send in the chat afterwards. And I strongly recommend that you read it, because it's a survey and it will give you a very good understanding of the different techniques and where you can start. And it's an overview, so you can decide which one is the right technique for you. Reweighting is a technique where you can be assigning different ways to different features, so just to say that if this feature is correlated with the race, I just needed to have less weight. I need to focus more on the qualification of the person. So you could assign weights to the to your features and before you even start building the algorithm. So that's a one technique. Resampling is a technique that is good, but at the same time has a lot of drawbacks, because you're actually playing with the data. And before we go with the data, I just want to note that each data point is a person. And then when you're trying to resample data, when you're trying to do anything with the data, whether it's pre-processing or post-processing, you have to make sure that you're going with the legal requirements in the country where you're at, where you're living, where you're going to deploy these systems, and make sure that when you're resampling, you're not violating any of these laws. Sampling also doesn't show to be that very effective, but it's a good technique to try. Relabeling and perturbation, you could also read more about that. It's a popular technique right now. Causal methods, and then adversarial learning. Adversarial learning is something that I'm very interested in. It's mainly because adversarial examples are a way to improve the robustness, and that goes well with the definition that I have about bias. And I believe that adversarial learning is still early stage, but it definitely has some promising future for mitigating bias. So these are different techniques that you could use to mitigate bias. However, it's not that helpful to look only at these, because simply you can look at different fields and see that it can be helpful for you to use this technique in mitigating bias, although it's not a bias technique. So how do you choose the right technique for yourself? How do you go browse the different techniques that people use to increase the robustness and know that it is the right technique for your solution? First, your approach should not be biased. You need to choose or possibly build your own technique that is to solve bias, but you need to make sure that it's not biased in itself. You need to define, so what is normal according to this technique, and what is the outlier for this technique. And you just, I mean, of course, you probably know that we go with the normal distribution. We want our model to fit the normal distribution, and the outliers are the ones that are going to be discriminated against. So you need to see what is normal and what is outlier, and you need to see if there is any possible way to change that, to change the focus and not make it a black and white approach. When looking for approaches, you can ask, like, so can I represent data in a different way? Is there a possibility that I switch the normal and outlier representation of the data that I have? Then you can ask the question, is this approach acceptable from the point of view of the stakeholders? And here I'm just going to refer again that the stakeholders is the most important part of all of this equation, because simply I'm very well versed about like different experiences of different people. I read a lot about social justice, discrimination, and all these stuff. However, that doesn't entitle me as a person who says, okay, so now I know what they want. I simply know how to design a solution because I'm a tech person. I mean, I'm talking about you, but I can't really decide what is good for them. They have to decide, they have to tell me what is good for them, and I have to listen to them. So simply, we need to start moving from developing a solution for the stakeholders to developing a solution with the stakeholders hand in hand. So that's very critical. And when you're trying to choose that technique, you need to make sure that from the point of view of the stakeholder, they see that it is an acceptable way that for them. And last question to ask is, does it really respect the data? Again, each data point is a person. So does this technique respect the data? Does it respect the human being behind this data? Second point to look into when you're trying to build your technique is that the approach should not introduce new types of bias. So that's when we're talking about synthetic data. And we were saying that it might introduce new types of bias. So whatever approach you choose, even if you were talking about the other approaches that I mentioned from that survey, whenever you apply any of them to your system, you need to make sure that to test it again for not only the bias types that you were solving for, but all of the bias types that you know of. And then you need to see a good approach is approach that is not going to introduce new types of bias to your system. The third and last point is to choose an algorithm that will give you accuracy fairness trade-off. And actually, accuracy fairness trade-off is something real. And that actually goes well also with the definition of bias that is related to robustness. So if our algorithm is not robust enough, is actually, and we're trying to make it more fair, which is more robust, that means we're going to have better accuracy. And that's why the fairness accuracy trade-off is something that is also like dependent on the definition of bias. So what I'm going to say is, let's agree on something, that accuracy fairness trade-off is something that we should not really care about, because if we have the right technique, that means our accuracy is going to increase because we're just optimizing for better robustness. And then choose the metric that maximizes your fairness. And then that's actually another start point for you to go back to your algorithm and see how you can improve the accuracy. Um, but your priority should be maximizing fairness. And it's a tough decision to make, because I know that the profit model of whatever you're working on is important, but then again, like the virtues of it, of maximizing fairness, is known to be giving back good results. So I know it's a tough decision, but it's gonna definitely give you like a restful night when you put your head on the pillow and say, okay, I did good today. I prioritized fairness over accuracy. And it's gonna make you feel really good. So these are three techniques for you to really decide what is the best way to what is the best technique for you to choose or develop. And I totally encourage you to develop your own technique to mitigate bias, simply because we don't have enough. I mean, as much as you can, to add to this field is going to be huge. So and then it's going to be something that works for your specific solution. So I definitely encourage you to build your own technique. uh, there is another technique to mitigate bias that I would like to mention here, which is neurosymbolic AI. So that is something that is not really related to bias. I haven't seen any research that is talking about neurosymbolic AI as a technique to mitigate bias, but whenever I read about it, it's very interesting to see it. And it talks about merging the good old-fashioned AI with the current neural networks that we have. So you could see that it leverages the accuracy pretty well, and at the same time it provides us with a different way to represent data based on the rules that we can add to this. And so I see this as a very interesting approach. It's my favorite. So if you also would like to talk more about this, do ask me the questions, or send me an email, and I would love to continue this conversation with you. The interesting part about this is that the symbolic part of these new architecture of neural networks is really related to our understanding of the data. Once we have that good understanding of the data, we could definitely build better architectures. So yeah, do talk to me about this. Now let's talk about stuff that you can do right now, as of today. So this is like the cherry on top of the three action areas that I have mentioned earlier. Stuff that you could do right now is work with a diverse team. Check your team that you're working with. Is it diverse enough? If it's not, talk to your supervisor, talk to the at work, or whether it's at research or whatever, and tell them that we need to have a conversation about diversity, how we can increase the diversity of our team, because if you see that that figure about bias types, it's the very start point, and it's a very good leverage point that you could start from and mitigate, just like minimize the bias that you have at the end. Second point, which I mentioned earlier, is work with stakeholders. If you're developing a solution that touches with any group, even if you are a member of that group, don't say that it's enough. You need to work with other people in that group too, with you, because different people inside a group have different experiences, and that is actually a level individual level bias. So you also have to make sure that the stakeholders you have on your team are also diverse enough. Uh, Third action point you could take is talk to people from other bubbles as much as you can. Be sure that you're not alone in this journey. If you're feeling that this is a data science problem, or this is a social science problem, or whether it's an algorithmic design problem, it's not clear yet. We're trying at all fronts to understand where's the root cause of bias. And so try to talk to other people who you think might be adjacent to your area, and you think bias might be in their area, and you can work together. So these are stuff that you could think about after this presentation, and see which one applies to you, and try to work in it actually now. And yeah, I would love to continue this conversation with you. We definitely need all hands on deck, as I mentioned. So please don't hesitate contacting with me, sending me an email. I would love to talk more about this.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. This is such a great talk. I learned a lot from you today, and there's a lot of new terms or like new techniques that I never heard of before. Recently, I switched joined the data governance board of my company, and so there's a lot of things that we need to start thinking about or strategic on how to deal with the data, especially my company working solely with government. So it even tied into more decisions that they make, in fact, like affected lots of people in that municipality. So now let's move on to the Q&A. Let me share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, okay, so first, let's go to the first question. There are a lot of negative news, but I'm wondering, are there any examples of good or great companies that have done well in reducing bias and serve as good role models to follow within the AI communities? So I think negative news in here mentioning about, like, for example, Katrina mentioned earlier about Lemonade Insurance, which is a company that use at first they mentioned that they use facial recognition, like some facial feature to decide who could be a potential like insurance fraud and stuff like that. And so we were swallowed with lots of those negative news. But there must be companies that are doing good and great example in this.
Yeah,
Do you
I
know any?
I totally agree with you that there are a lot of negative news, and sometimes that would bring us like to depression of like, is there even a way out of this? But there are some companies that are really working on this. So first of all, there are like this people who are working in AI ethics, and they are like people from all different kinds of backgrounds. So they are really, I mean, we're trying our best to have as much companies as we can to chime into these conversations. One specific example is a company that we actually, I actually worked with ethical intelligence to review their technology, and they were exceptionally open about like addressing all of the ethical issues that they have. It's a company called Anyone. It's an advice based company that any person who has any kind of experience could go and give their advice, and it's a human centered technology, so that means that it will be full of ethical considerations, and they were very open about accepting all of our suggestions. We also suggested a solution for them, and they are now starting to implement these suggestions that we have. So we were like, that's beautiful. It's beautiful to see people who are now interested in having ethics as the core of their technology, and they were actually seeing it as a way to improve to improve the quality of their products. So I understand that there are a lot of negative news. However, there are also like a lot of companies that are now aware, and that is all because there are very good people who are trying to do their best to educate about AI ethics.
I'll just
Yeah,
chime in
and then
as
actually,
someone who comes out of media, saying
yeah,
that the negative news thing, that's media bias. Media companies typically report negative news, what's on fire, what's not working. And so I think that we should also just be careful about that.
Yeah, totally agree.
that's a great point. That's a great point. And actually, a follow-up question on this one is that because you have been working with that company, so you know that that company is ethically good, or at least they are trying to fight the bias. But as like other people who's looking into a company, or like as like lots of people right now looking for a job, how do you evaluate that? How do you assess that from an like outsider standpoint?
Yeah, so It's a very good question, because when I graduated from my master's and I was like ready to start working in the tech sector, and then I was shocked by all the companies that are like either working with the military or working on ethical um, values that doesn't align with my own values, and it's very tough to maybe just, I mean, I wouldn't say tough, because it's just like my very personal bias that is chiming in here, because I'm like, I was so angry at the beginning, like, how comes there is no company that is working on ethics, or like working in an ethical way. So to be honest, like, I can't answer without being biased here. However, don't lose hope. Like, there are always like good companies that are working out there, and when I started working on ethics, I started noticing like so many other companies who are actually interested in being ethical. So do your research. I mean, it's gonna take you long. It's been so long for me trying to find an ethical tech company to work with, but it's there. I mean, now I'm seeing a lot of them.
Yeah, and I also think that it's not like purely black and white, right? There's a lot of people's on their way. Um, yeah, let's move on to the next question. I have been trying to understand the term of the equality of opportunity, how this term is used in creating fairness in machine learning system. Could you also give it an example?
I would love to answer this question actually outside here, because I could share with you some resources to help you with that. So if you can send me an email, I would love to send you like something that describes equality of opportunity, and some ways to include it in the machine learning systems. So yeah, I know it's anonymous, but if you're feeling comfortable with that, please send me an email and I will share with you the resources.
Or you can also like share with us, and then you would put it in the either the community notes or on the Slack channel, or we can send it out after the event. Yeah.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Um, let's move. So the next question is, with so many things to consider when we design a model, layering bias checks will add more time to the process. Where do we start, and how to balance ethics and shipping the product quickly?
That's a very good question, because it's something that usually scares the companies from really starting the ethics conversation. So there are so many layers to add to check. However, if you start with the bias considerations at the very beginning of designing your product, you won't have to do all of this, and then it will be only like as simple. I mean, now there are like a lot of tools that you could use that is not going to take any more time to just do the check. However, to reduce the time is really start from the beginning. From the beginning, take into consideration that you need your algorithm not to be biased. So where do we start is really at the very beginning. Design it in an unbiased way, and everything will fall into the timeline that you have specified for that. How to balance ethics and shipping product quickly. I don't have an answer for that. It's just because it's so at the beginning I was like trying to figure out a way, and so like one of my colleagues, he was like he's a philosopher, and he said like, but ethics is something that should be prioritized over anything else. And I was like hit with that answer, which I definitely understand from a virtues point of view, and I understand also the company's point of view about that. So it's really a values prioritization that the company will have to do, and it depends on how quickly do we identify bias types, how quickly can we have a good measures for bias, and really trying to use different techniques. And it depends on you also developing that technique that would give you ability to ship your product as quickly as you want. So it's still like an infant field that we're working on. Now we have more people chiming into the conversation, which is very good. So there's a lot of promising future for this field. So let's hope that we'll have a good technique that will not compromise any other kind of company values.
Mhm. And I would just like add a small point from a person working like building models for a client. So one of the things I was thinking that is very similar to is like when you started writing unit tests, right? Unit test is helping your models or like any kind of design system to be better, but it also takes time. And where do we start, or how much do we do? It's similar to this one, is that like you just started it. So the first starting is the hardest part. And then right now there's a lot of toolkits out there to help you with it. So for example, before this today, I'm not aware of that many types of bias, but at least I want to capture somewhat things that could contribute to bias. So I use like the package model card. So that package will at least help you to communicate with all the stakeholder and business side, what kind of data that used to fit in this model, how is the performance. So from there, other people can also chime in to help me look into is there any potential bias that happening to the model that I built, because I myself will not see all the things that I don't know. So I think that is one of the things that you could look into that help you to speed up the process. You don't have to account for everything, but asking for other people to help think about that. Thanks. The next question would be, there are many types of bias as you have showed us on the slide. Is there any type that are more dangerous or harmful than others?
That's a very good question, because it's something that is very context dependent. So depending on your algorithm, if you are trying to say that, I mean, I don't have an example on top of my head right now, but it depends on the context on the purpose of your system. And then you can decide like what is the biggest harm. And I think this is the work of the risk and impact assessment of the company or something like that. And they will have to say like the outcomes of this algorithm, how is it going to impact the stakeholders? How is it going to impact the people that we're building this system for? And in those risks, they will have stuff that will indicate for you what is the type of bias that you will need to prioritize. There are a lot, but again, it depends on the context, on where you live, and who are the stakeholders and the purpose of your system. Really, it hugely depends also on the task, like is it classification, is it regression, and all these types. So there are so many types of bias. Of course, like the biggest harm is when it's related to the basic human needs and human rights. So if you see any of the bias types that you have identified, something that touches that, then that is the most harmful one that you need to prioritize.
Yeah. The next question we have is there any suggested projects that I can start practicing on fighting bias?
I love that question. And I love the energy. That's good. So there are so many people trying to build tools. So you can try to work on these tools. However, there are also a lot of data sets that are used to play with to see how you can fight bias. And I'm actually just going to make note that I could also share these resources, like for example, the census data set. It's a data set that is full of protected attributes, and then you need to build a solution based on that data set to be unbiased. Usually people use it in most of the research because it's a very good example of biased data sets, and then they try to build their solutions on it. So I can suggest some data sets to start playing with, and you can start practicing bias. And I can also suggest some tools that you could start using and understand how people are trying to mitigate bias and what are the techniques that they can use. So I'll also share that with you, Dawn.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
So how to train myself in AI ethics? I think this one is covered a lot in also Katrina talks and also Rahaf talks. Is there anything else you want to add on top of the talk, or we can move on to the next question?
Yeah, there are workshops that are also like happening around AI ethics. There are so many webinars happening around AI ethics. So do like keep searching for these happening around you, and you can definitely like start by just like increasing your knowledge by attending these webinars or workshops. So I guess that's what I can add to what Katrina said.
I'll just add, I'm launching in conjunction with a post-secondary institution, I'm launching a certification program that will be ready in the fall. I can't say a lot about it right now, but I'm happy to stay in touch with Women in Data Science if that's something of interest, and let you know when we're launching.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. We're definitely gonna send it out to our audience, either through our Slack channel or in our meetup. We definitely gonna want to have more discussion in our meetup communities on this topic. On the next question, which bias identifying metrics have been developed and implemented so far?
Which bias identifying metric have been developed and implemented so far? Like bias identifying metric, I'm not sure. What do you mean by this exactly?
I think maybe the audience want to know, like, for example, when you want to quantify bias, what kind of metrics that have been developed so far, developed and implemented so far.
Okay, so in terms of quantifying bias, it's fairness metrics, like fairness definitions, are ones that have been developed and being implemented so far. So that's about like really quantifying bias, but identify bias types, it's something that is basically, I haven't seen them. I'll have to look a little bit back into that, but it's usually made by human judgment on deciding what is the bias. No, it's not. Okay, I'll have to look into that and see if there are any tools that I could share with you. Yeah, in terms of bias identifying metric, I would, the way I understand it is really how do we quantify bias? The best way to do it right now is through fairness definitions that I mentioned earlier in the presentation.
Yeah. Is there any book that you would recommend to improve my understanding of bias?
That's a good question. I am more of a research papers reader, so there are a few research papers that I could recommend for you to read.
That would be great. And I think Katrina mentioned a lot of books in her presentation on not just like bias, but also in other part related to AI ethics that we would like to, when we share the slides, our audience can look at those list of books. But for list of academic papers or research paper that you think that would be highlighted, because nowadays every day there's a lot of research paper coming out, and just go through that to pick ones is already a challenge. So having some suggestion would be great for us.
Yeah, so actually there are like two main papers that I have used in my presentation, and they are included in the slides. So you could start there, and I usually recommend you to start there. It gives you like a holistic view of the situation right now in terms of bias types and mitigation techniques. So these are a good point, but I can also look into what I could just like add to that list.
That would be great. Okay, and the next question we have, keeping in mind the need to manage deadlines and stakeholder pressure to ship a product, what are some of the most important bias reducing checks and balance we would incorporate into our pipelines? So this is very similar to the previous question, but I think it's more narrowed down to some kind of checkpoint or some kind of a checklist that we can do just quickly to see if we can look into bias in our system.
Okay, quickly. So our mentality of like move fast and break things is it's gonna be like something that we need to start changing probably. It's something that I definitely understand. It's the culture of this business. But again, like I don't have a quick solution. And if I tell you that there is a technique that is going to eliminate bias entirely, I wouldn't be very transparent with you, because all of the techniques that I've mentioned are just stuff that will improve the fairness by maybe 1 to 2%, and it will decrease it will decrease the accuracy by a lot more. But it's
Mhm.
it's not something that we have like a clear-cut definition of it, so that we have that solution that we could do in a very quick way. Most of the techniques are just stuff to mitigate bias and just like to make it more gentle on the user. So we don't have a way to solve bias yet, and then that is the first step that we have to solve, and then we can talk about checks that are going to be quick to reduce bias. I'm very sorry to like put this in the context of that. It's very uncertain. It's very like early stage, but that's why we need you. That's why we need everybody working in this field to start thinking about bias, because we need your ideas to solve this. So if you're interested in finding like a bias reducing check that could balance your products and all of the other values, and that could be quick, then I would love to hear from you. How would you do it?
Yeah, and so I just saw that one. We just created the Slack channel ethics in AI in our Vancouver Women in Data Science Slack. So that would be a great place for people to bounce ideas with each other and share what you do or what you are planning to do, or any projects that you want to get your hand on, and see if there are people interested in working with you on that.
That's
Yeah,
awesome.
that's great. Okay, so that's the power of the community. Eh?
Yeah.
The next question is, if we would want to set metrics personally to see if we are getting better in looking at ethical issue in our lives, what would your advice be? And how do we start and track our progress?
Okay, so if you would want to set metrics personally, if you're getting better at looking at ethical issues in our lives, okay, first thing, go out and attend social science events. I know it's not our thing. We feel very scared to go outside of our bubble, but it's very important. And actually, the thing that started like me thinking about ethics is an event that I've attended about discrimination, like equity, diversity, and discrimination. And it was like a mind-blowing event for me, because I was looking at all of the different conversations from my point of view, and then I started seeing it from other people's point of view and how they experience it. And then I started working with different philosophers, different social scientists, and they had a different way of understanding technology and how they want to use it. At the end, we're really good at designing something, but we're not the only people who are going to use it. There are a lot of other people that we need to start understand the way they think, and we need to start understand the way that they need to have uh, uh, this technology being developed to meet their needs. So first thing to do is attend events in the adjacent field that you're working on. So you're building a technology for what, and then try to attend an event in that area. Uh,
Oh, that's
and that's a good way to start like looking into your own experience and reflect on your technology. As Katrina was saying, also about reflections. How do we start and track our progress? I love like how is this being like, okay, so how do we quantify that? It's if you can design a metric to quantify our progress, I would love to hear about it. But really, like it's a if you want to start in that field, you need to understand that mistakes is something fundamental in that, and you don't need to focus on your progress, because you also need to understand that you'll do mistakes, and that's definitely part of the progress. So take that factor into consideration when you're designing the metric. Making mistakes is fundamental, and then you can really decide how you're doing, if you're doing any kind of progress or not, based on the technology, based on the feedback from the stakeholders. And yeah, um, yeah, I love the energy in that question.
I'll jump in with
That's good.
maybe a fun way to track your progress. How diverse is your personal network? So if you look at something like LinkedIn, for example, are you stuck in one area, or do you have a lot of diversity in measuring your network? I think that could be an interesting map to do if you wanted to quantify it in some way.
Mhm. That's like really interesting. Sometimes I would say looking into my like one of the things that like I mentioned earlier is that when we listen to music, it's sometimes we just keep listening to the same type, and then so one of the things sometimes I do is that I ask whenever I meet new people, I would just ask like, oh hey, what kind of music you listen to, kind of icebreaker thing. But also I can see that, oh, is there anything new or interesting things that I can explore myself. So yeah, I think that would be a fun way to track how's your diversity in the
Yeah, it
couple.
can be very personalized. So that's a good point.
Yeah. The next question is, please tell me the path I should take to enter AI ethics. So I think this is very similar to what are the paths that you could be doing in AI ethics. If you want to focus or specialize in AI ethics, what are the direction you could go into, right? It seems like there's a very broad sector.
Yeah, I think I will also, I believe Katrina might have something to add to what I'm gonna say, because I'm very biased, and I'm like, whenever I hear a conversation about bias, I'm like, I'm there. It's my passion, and that's what I do. So what is the best start point for you to enter AI ethics? I would definitely say start with bias and try to solving that problem. However, I can't separate myself from being that biased about this topic. And then in bias, what are the action points that you can take is actually, if you want like any elaboration on any of the points that I mentioned, like any of the start points where you can start the conversation, please do email me, and I'm happy to have like a one-on-one session to see like where you're at and how you can enter this conversation in the best personalized way for you. I would love to do that.
Yeah, I would add to that and say, start with the skills that you have today. So I'm not a data scientist, I'm not a technical person, but I am a media person and I know how to tell stories. And so I started by making a podcast. I started by starting a blog and writing about it. I'm an educator, so now I'm building content for education. So I would say, what are the skills that you have today? Maybe you're a lawyer, maybe you understand the legal frameworks really well, but you want to take an AI ethics lens to this. So you don't, again, I'm really passionate about saying you don't have to have the technical background. If you do, that's fantastic. And there's lots of different pathways for you to go with that as well. But maybe you have a different background that you want to apply to this field.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of intersect between different fields with this career path, and so I think it's less barrier to entry, I'd say.